Hi class, and welcome to the last lecture before we have our first in-person class. This is actually modules 8 and 9. They're both about assessment and instrumentation more broadly, and so they are combined. In this lecture, I'll cover assessment and instrumentation in sex research fairly briefly. I've also uploaded some readings that might be useful to you to think about how these more general concepts apply specifically to doing sexuality research and assessing sexual behavior more specifically. But the three things that we'll talk primarily about in this lecture are interviewing versus self-report, survey and interview design, and question design. So, not surprisingly, assessment and instrumentation in sex research involves asking what we'll call sensitive questions. As we talked about in the ethics lecture, these questions may not be as sensitive perhaps as they once were, or as a lot of people think they might be. So I have sensitive in quotes here. And sex research often is an area in which behavior cannot be ethically observed. We can definitely do some levels of behavioral observation depending on what we're talking about. Increasingly, researchers are doing really phenomenal physiological research that does involve some behavioral assessment and physiological assessment. But in a lot of ways, we can't follow people around and watch them have sex on a day-to-day basis. So we have to rely heavily on self-report and on interviews, both retrospective and prospective data collection. And we have to think a lot about how willing we would be and how willing people are more generally to disclose things like how many sexual partners you've had in your life, information about your sexual risk behavior, STI status, and how able we are to report certain things, like how satisfied we are sexually, how much you love a partner, how much you worry about potential negative sexual outcomes, or going back to the behavior, how many sexual partners you've had in your life. And so there are a lot of methodological challenges involved in sex research that are present to some degree in assessing a variety of behavior and attitudes and psychological and psychosocial factors more broadly, but there are also some issues that are fairly specific to sex research. So we'll talk a bit about interviewing versus self-report, and the book lays out structured interviewing in chapter 9, and then more of the survey or the self-report questionnaire in chapter 10, sort of the self-administered questionnaire, as he calls it. And it's really interesting because he talks a lot about the structured interview being one of the more common ways of conducting research, and the self-administered questionnaire as being maybe a second most common way of conducting research. And I actually think of these in reverse. I think of the self-administered questionnaire in psychological research and in social science research more generally, but especially in sex research, as being probably one of the most common ways of collecting data. So when we think about the mode of survey administration, I think about self-administered questionnaire as being probably one of the more common ways that we collect data. This is when a respondent fills out a survey or a questionnaire in private. As the book talks about, and as you probably are not surprised to hear, having a self-administered questionnaire increases the validity of reporting of sensitive behaviors like drug and alcohol use, condom use, sexual activity more broadly. Your book talks quite a bit about the postal questionnaire. I have never used a postal questionnaire. I am not sure that I can recall any research off the top of my head that has. There are certainly people who do that, but I'm guessing that is not something most of you will encounter or engage in the course of your research. You can certainly correct me if I'm making assumptions or if I'm wrong about that. So don't get too caught up on all of what he says about postal questionnaires. And then interviewer administered questionnaires can happen via telephone, via face-to-face. As I'll talk in a minute, those can be computer assisted. And these are great in a lot of ways. They may keep the respondent from skipping questions. They can help clarify questions and help people navigate the survey. These I often think about, at least in the kind of work that I've done, as being particularly relevant for clinical assessments. So often psychologists, social workers, counselors, things like that will administer specific clinical assessments, and those are done. Those are interviewer administered. And so that's often what I think about when I think about structured interviews. And so for some of you, those might be completely relevant, and some of the guidance that he gives around those might be particularly relevant for you, particularly if you're going to use something like that in your dissertation research. And I think it's really lovely in chapter 10 that he gives some pros and cons of advantages and disadvantages of a self-administered questionnaire over the structured interview. So I'm not going to go through those at a whole lot of length, because I think he does a nice job of giving a sense of some of the distinctions between those, some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of those. And so we'll talk a bit more about some of the advantages and disadvantages as we design our own survey in class. But these are sort of the basic two ways of thinking about assessment that I typically encounter. He also talks a bit about diary data collection, which is increasingly common and popular within sexuality research. Diary data collection can reduce recall bias by recording data on a daily basis. So if you ask somebody to tell me what you did yesterday, you're likely to get much better information on a day-to-day basis than asking people what they did over the course of the last month or the last 3 months, for example. You can have the respondent make journal entries, fill out a survey every day. This can in some ways reduce some social desirability bias because they're reporting on a day-by-day basis rather than having to aggregate things themselves. So if they tell you yes or no that they had sex yesterday, who that partner was, they're not having to tell you at the end of a 3-month period that they had sex with a certain number of people, which they may want to attenuate in some ways because of social desirability. This also allows for greater flexibility in terms of completing the data collection on a day-to-day basis. On the downside, they may not be completed. So I didn't upload any daily diary studies for the measurement readings that I did, that I put into the shared files in Campus Cruiser, and that I linked to in the course content for these modules. But you can look at most daily diary studies excuse me, and see that they'll say, X% of daily diaries were completed, or here's the average number that were completed in this period. So you do have to allow for some non-completion in there as well. And you can prompt people to do these. You can do daily phone, text, or email check-ins that can be either initiated by the respondent, which allows them some flexibility, but again, they may not do it. Or initiated by the interviewer or by the researcher, which is much more common, I think. It means the participant's more likely to follow through, though if you try them by phone, you may get them at an appropriate time. These are often done by text or email. Again, that relies on people checking their email at a somewhat regular interval, or responding to that text message and actually following through with that. Your book doesn't mention this method, but this is a method that I have super commonly used in sexuality research that I've done in behavioral health research, and that a lot of, I think, public health and HIV researchers have used. It's called the timeline fallback. The timeline fallback was originally designed for alcohol research and alcohol intervention work, and it was originally designed, excuse me, as kind of a clinical assessment and as a way to give people feedback on their drinking. And essentially what the timeline fallback does a day-by-day retrospective assessment of behavior. So most of the work that I've done is done a 30-day period, and you sit down with people with a calendar and you say, okay, let's start with yesterday. Tell me about the sex that you had yesterday. How many partners did you have? Okay, partner number 1 yesterday. Did you have vaginal sex with them? Did you have oral sex with them? Did you have anal sex with them? Tell me a little bit about that partner. Do you know their HIV status? What is that? And so the great thing about the timeline fallback is that it's very detailed, but it's often complex, which is often why it's interviewer administered. And so you have some interviewer effects there. You have to count on people being willing to tell you every single day all of the activity that they engaged in. This is a methodology that I have used very extensively as a research assistant. collecting data over the last 15 years or so. And so you have to sit down with somebody, and particularly when we're doing this with gay men, you have to get positionality. Did you fuck him? Did he fuck you? Did you come inside of him? Did he come inside of you? And so you have to go through every day for the last 30, 60, sometimes 90 days and ask people those same questions every day. And for people who are particularly sexually active, you may have 3 or 4 partners a day. And so with every partner, you're saying, did he come inside of you? Did you come inside of him? Etc. And so I have had, I think my longest timeline follow back interview took 3 hours. And it was one of the more painful things I've ever had to do. And I'm guessing if you ask that guy, probably one of the more painful things that he ever had to do as well. So the timeline follow back is fantastic for getting a lot of detail, for getting event level data. So we often ask about alcohol and drug use. And so you can get a sense of whether the sex occurred when somebody was under the influence of alcohol or drugs. You can sometimes get a sense of how much they had had to drink. You can get a lot of detail about their partners. And so it allows you a lot of flexibility in data collection and data analysis, though it is fairly complex to use and to administer. And most people typically don't have people do this on their own. So it's often not a self-administered questionnaire. A quick note, I won't say a whole lot about this. A lot of the work that I have done has been longitudinal, so we assess people over the course of, let's say, a year and interview them every 3 months over the course of the year. In one study, we did every 4 months over the course of a year. And there may be reactivity, so that repeatedly reporting what some people might interpret as bad behavior or stigmatized behavior is often the case. May cause the respondent to actually alter their behavior. And so thus it might not be an accurate depiction of natural circumstances and natural behavior. Some people talk about this as assessment as intervention. I did a work on a club drug study where we asked people who reported using any one of 6 club drugs, which we counted as cocaine, MDMA, LSD, ketamine, GHB, or methamphetamine. And so we sat down and did a timeline follow back with people. And then, so they got to look at a calendar and see the number of days in the last 30 days that they had done cocaine or done meth or something like that. And so often I would finish this interview with people and they would say, whoa, I did cocaine a lot more than I thought I did, or I do cocaine a lot more than I thought I do. And this study was not an intervention study at all. It was not designed to change people's behavior, just to see how their behavior changed over the course of a year as they got a little older. And so often people would come in at their next assessment and say, wow, that interview, doing that calendar really changed the way that I thought about my cocaine use. And so I actually have way less cocaine use now. And so that's not a natural way of looking at their behavior. And some people call that assessment as intervention. So if you're going to do a longitudinal study, it's something that you might want to think about a little bit. For a lot of people doing interviewer administered work, they'll do computer assisted data collection. This can help to provide instructions for respondents. If you're going to do a self-administered version, it can be problematic if you have low literacy in your respondents, but it can allow for some privacy of self-administered questionnaires, perhaps with some assistance of the interviewer. Some of these programs are really expensive, so it may be cost prohibitive. But there are a lot of variations of these. One that I have used a lot is ACASI, so Audio Computer Assisted Survey Instrument. And the great thing about this is if you're working with populations with low literacy, what the ACASI will do is read the questions aloud to them and read the options aloud to them as it highlights each of those. So it can help correct for that. So there are a variety of different ways that you can go about combining interviewer administration with self-administration and use the computer to help in a variety of ways. Internet-based data collection is super common now and probably what a lot of you are going to engage in for your dissertation. It's a lot of what I have done in my research. And so this allows you to get a large number of surveys fairly easily. There are some people who argue that there is some selection bias. for those without an internet connection or without a device on which they can do this. There's some work, increasingly more and more work, indicating that this is maybe not as much of a problem. But again, this depends on who your population is that you're interested in. There is increasingly better and better data collection softwares that work on phones or tablets. And as most people have smartphones, that is becoming less and less of an issue. And so it's not about internet connection, it may just be about data plans. So you may have to be sensitive to how much data somebody has and how they might be willing to spend that data on your survey or not. But I think as technology gets better, as more and more companies have unlimited data plans, this is becoming less and less of an issue for us. What it is often a problem for is missing data. So people can skip through things, not answer things. You can force responses to some degree. And we'll talk about that a lot more as we talk about designing our own survey. Obviously, when you're doing interviewer-administered structured interviews or semi-structured interviews in any way, there are interviewer effects, potentially. So interviewers should be well trained to explain the research, get cooperation and buy-in of our participants, to encourage thoughtful responses, be consistent, take time to answer the questions and allow people to answer our questions, be a good listener and be non-judgmental. And we also always want to consider the potential effects of interviewer characteristics on respondent answers. So age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, all of those may have an impact on how people respond to questions. I have a colleague who did an analysis of qualitative interviews that we did with men and women, but he was specifically interested in the effects of interviewer gender on the answers that we got from young men. And he found a really different way of talking about sex when men talked about it with other men versus when men talked about it with women. They tended to be generally more polite and a little bit more reserved when they talked about it with women, whereas when they talked about it with men, they tended to posture a little bit more. And so we would get a lot more terminology where guys would say things like, yeah, I love to jackhammer her, or, say things like that they wouldn't say at all with the women. So you certainly can have some effects there of your interviewer characteristics. In any interview, surveys or interviews, there are situational factors. These always take place within a context. This context may create some desire to appear, and I have all of these in quotes, good, normal, healthy, not engaging in stigmatized behavior. So responses may be biased to help make the respondent appear favorably to the interviewer. We always have to think about the setting that we provide and what kinds of messages we're communicating in that setting. So do you have posters on the wall? Is there public health messaging around? And how might that change people's answers? And do they have any fear of reprisal? So fear of disclosing information to other people. This may be particularly an issue with kids or adolescents or stigmatized populations. This may be exacerbated if the behavior is illegal, like drug use or sex work or something like that. The setting also makes a difference in terms of privacy. So we often want to try and ensure privacy if somebody is in our own setting or urge them to try and fill out the survey in a private setting. If it's an internet-based survey or an email-based survey. And this may vary from person to person. So some people may feel most secure at home, others at work, others at a coffee shop or in a neutral location of some sort. And again, children and adolescents may present particular challenges in this regard. There's some research indicating that more sensitive behaviors are more likely to be reported at school than at home. But is this about peer pressure to try and look like they're engaging in more sex, drugs, alcohol, or is it fear of reprisal by having their parents potentially looking over their shoulder at home? Social desirability obviously influences people's responses in a variety of ways. There is a great study by Alexander and Fisher where they use a bogus pipeline methodology wherein they ask people about their number of sexual partners And they do this when they have people hooked up to what they tell them is a lie detector. And what they find is is generally when we ask men and women about the number of sexual partners they've had in their lifetime, we see gender differences such that men report more partners than women do. When you hook people up to a lie detector or make them believe that you're hooking them up to a lie detector, we know that those are not so effective or actual things, really. But when we tell people that we're hooking them up to a lie detector, we see that gender difference pretty much eliminated. So men report fewer partners, women report more partners, and they kind of meet in the middle there. So we know that there are social desirability effects in responses and reporting. This may vary quite a bit for different samples of people. So topic sensitivity and social desirability vary across groups and people. We can try and minimize these effects by assuring anonymity and confidentiality. Some people will measure it and use really standard measures of social desirability. I've put that in a few scales. I've honestly never looked at it. So I think kind of the best thing we can do is discuss it as a potential influence on all of our results and conclusions, because it's always going to be there for everything. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do research, but we have to acknowledge that that's a possibility in all of our research. So that's all I'll say about sort of the mode of administration or the mode of assessment in terms of interviewer versus self-report. I'll talk a little bit about survey and interview design, and then I'll spend much more time on question design. One of the reasons I chose this book actually is because I really like that the book spends this much time talking about question design and about survey design. I think it's not something that most basic methods textbooks cover. And so it's one of the reasons I chose this book, because I really appreciated that level of detail. So in terms of survey and interview design, I'll talk about primarily presentation. So presentation is really key. It's something I think we tend to get caught in the methodological details and making sure our measures are correct and getting at what we're trying to get at. All of that is essential. And then we just throw it together and throw it at people. So I would really urge you to think a lot about presentation. This is really important. Surveys should be easy to move through and to see and to read. I think progress bars are really fantastic. I think your book might mention this briefly, but letting people know where they are in a survey and how much more they have to go makes it much more likely that they'll complete your survey. I like having graphics typically if I'm doing a big study. Thinking about color schemes, what's easiest to read, thinking about what's easy to read on a computer versus a tablet versus a phone. Thinking about font and text size and what's easiest for people to read and move through. I like to chunk question topics together so that this entire section is about a particular thing, so that you're not jumping all over the place and asking people to try and follow along with you. Your book mentions this, and I think it's I have a lot of the things that your book mentions I won't go over, but I think providing clear instructions is really, really important. So clear instructions on terminology. This is something that I see in sex research so often. How many times have you had sex in the past 3 months? How many partners have you had sex with? So what do we mean by sex? And there's some pretty decent research showing that people who answer surveys and engage in research have all sorts of definitions of what they mean by sex. And so we're probably getting really inaccurate estimates here. Because some people might say oral sex counts, some people might say it has to be penis and vagina, some people might say anal sex, some people might have super broad definitions and say, any kink behavior, any sexual contact. When we would do eligibility screeners at the research center that I worked at, we would say, have you had any sexual contact with another person that could potentially lead to orgasm? So that was this tremendously broad definition to see if people were eligible for studies. And then we would get much more specific as we went forward in that. And be specific about response option instructions and information as well. So oftentimes if I'm asking people to give me a number of times response, a count response, so how many times have you had vaginal sex in the past 3 months? And that could even be more specific, obviously. Sometimes I'll give people some math to help them. So if you've had sex on average twice a week in the last 2 months, that should be 3 months actually, that would equal 24 times. So give people some sense of the math so that they don't have to count on their fingers and toes or try and scratch it on paper or just try and ballpark estimate it. I'll often give people, particularly for alcohol and drug use, anything where there's a count, I'll try and help them do some of that math in their head. Obviously, filter questions. So your book talks a lot about this and gives some of the voting questions. So don't ask people who they voted for or how they voted in the last election, but ask them first if they even voted. And then if they didn't, you don't have to ask them how they voted. So using those questions to filter out and minimize the number of questions people actually get. Your book also talks a lot about question ordering. So which questions should be asked first, which should be asked later. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but one of the things your book doesn't mention is the option of counterbalancing. I think your book actually does say you shouldn't vary the order of questions. There are people who feel differently about that and feel like within a scale you could randomly present questions, or you could counterbalance such that half of the sample gets one scale before another, and half of the sample gets the reverse ordering of that. And one of the thoughts on that is any effects that we see from ordering of questions will then be washed out. So we can try and minimize those effects in some way so we don't have a systematic bias. And as we talked about before, we're asking sensitive questions, so we need to think a little bit about question placement. I often think about this as the Goldilocks kind of a rule, not too soon, not too late, just right. And so we have to think a little bit about what counts as a sensitive question, how soon we want to jump into that. Your book also talks a bit about question sequencing, which I mentioned in the last slide. They talk about doing attitudes before behaviors. And your book actually talks about doing demographics last. I often think about doing demographics first because it's a nice way to ease into answering questions and doesn't jump right into the sex. Some of those demographics may also be sensitive questions. So for me, I probably would feel equally as uncomfortable reporting my income as I would my sexual partners. And a lot of people might feel way more uncomfortable reporting their income or demographic information, for example, than they would talking about their sexual behavior. So that's always something we have to think about in terms of what might be sensitive to our population and how do we ease people into the survey while also catching their interest right away and asking questions that are relevant to the topic right away. So it's always this balancing act of jumping into it versus easing into it, catching their attention versus boring them. And I think always it helps to preface with reminders of confidentiality, any other provisions that we might give people, referrals, opportunities to speak with the clinician, etc. We can allow participants to refuse to answer questions or skip questions. This is obviously an issue of then having missing data. But I think ethically it's a good thing to allow people to refuse to answer or to skip questions. It can be challenging if those questions are eligibility questions, so you have to know the answer to that to know if the person is eligible to stay in your study. If it's a question that has filter questions based on it. So, for example, getting a sense of gender of partners. And so have you ever had sex with a man? Have you ever had sex with a woman? And then if they don't answer that, you don't know what follow-up questions to potentially ask them about the sex that they've had with men or women. And so you can program the survey such that if they've only had sex with men, you would only ask them follow-up questions about sex with men rather than both. And so if they don't answer that filter question, they may get a whole lot of questions that don't apply to them after that. Your book talks a little bit about helping to normalize behavior and beliefs. So, giving people a sense. I think the example that they use is maybe road rage. So, some people get really upset when they're driving, and so we have to be a little bit careful. I think about this, about using normalization to make sure that we're not leading people or giving them too much of a sense of how they should be responding. There's a great article by Fisher that demonstrated the effects of conveying specific norms on self-report of extradyadic sex. So they did this great experimental study where they had a Confederate participant. So they had two participants come in at the same time. One was a real participant, one was a fake participant or a Confederate. And the research assistant would pretend like they recognized the Confederate and say, "Oh, yeah, I know you. You used to be dating so and so, right?" And the Confederate participant would say, "Oh, yeah, we used to be dating, but I cheated on them, and so they broke up with me." And in one condition, the research assistant would say, "That's terrible. I can't believe you cheated on them. That's a terrible thing to do. That's awful. Anyway, let's go on with the research." And in the other condition, the research assistant would say, "Whatever, you're young, don't worry about it. Anyway, let's get on with the research." And what they found was that the real participants who were in the more restrictive or rigid set of norm condition reported far fewer extradyadic sex events, or were much less likely to report having cheated on their partners than the participants who were in the condition in which the research assistant conveyed that cheating on your partner was totally fine. So we know that those norms do affect the behavior that people report, but we have to also be careful about going too far in normalizing behavior and encouraging people to report behavior or more behavior perhaps than they've actually engaged in. We have to think about literacy and language conversation considerations, what kinds of language people might use. Sometimes IRBs will ask us to use fairly scientific and rigid language. I gave you the example before of the timeline follow back when we would say, did you fuck them? Did they fuck you? And we chose to use fairly explicit language because that's the language that people actually use when they talk, particularly if you're talking about gay and bisexual men in New York City. And so trying to use their language to some degree while not being sort of too explicit and out there. And thinking about what kinds of words they'll understand. And your book talks about that a little bit as well. I think a really great example is thinking about asking people about rape or sexual assault. Lynn Phillips wrote a great book that's called Flirting with Danger. And in that book, one of the things that she noted was that so often women would report in surveys and in interviews that they had never been raped, they had never been sexually assaulted. But then when she would ask very specific follow-up questions, asking them like, did this very specific thing happen to you? Did somebody have sex with you when you had initially said no and tried to get them not to have sex with you? That so many more women reported that that did happen to them. And so she did this series of qualitative interviews with people and found out that that women were reporting that like, oh, it was a really bad night. It was a misunderstanding. We were drinking. We had just gotten into this fight. He had a really bad day. And so they were really hesitant to label those experiences as rape or sexual assault. And so we have to think about the language that people not only might understand and use, but might be willing to put onto their experiences. And so a lot of the really good sexual assault measures will use very specific behavioral assessments of sexual assault or coercion. All right, so we'll talk more about question design now. Your book at the end of chapter 11 talks a little bit about using existing measures versus creating your own. I think that's a really useful conversation to have, and we can talk more about that as we talk about selecting measures for our own survey. Some of the benefits, obviously, to using or adapting existing measures is that they have some established reliability and validity. We can potentially compare our data with the data from other samples, and so we then have to go through a process of finding and deciding between measures, potentially making appropriate adaptations if that measure was used maybe with women before, but we want to use it with men or with trans women or or adolescent girls versus adult women. So we have to think about that adaptation process and if we would need to pilot, and then that reliability and validity might not be applicable if we do a whole lot of adaptation. And if we create new measures or questions, those are the bright side of those is that they're very specific to our needs. We typically want to consult the literature, colleagues, community members in doing that process, and do fairly extensive pilot testing for both usability and acceptability, reliability, validity, and variance. So we want to make sure that there is actually variability on responses to that question or to that measure so that it's actually useful. And I would say in general, as much as possible, don't reinvent the wheel if it's not necessary, particularly for your dissertation research. I don't think you should necessarily reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, so often we do need questions and measures that are very specific to our needs. So that's a sort of a balancing act that we often play. So I'll talk a little bit more about creating our own questions and measures. Your book mentions these specific questions that you should ask yourself and be asking yourself as you create questions and measures. What are your research questions? What's the purpose of the questions? And how will my participants understand and answer the questions? We also want to think about question specificity and clarity, and your book does some nice examples of this. I think behavior is a specific one. I mentioned sex before. In the last 3 months, I often like to give people a date reference when I give them some sort of time window, and you can do that really easily in most survey softwares. With how many partners have you engaged in any sexual activity? And again, we might want to be more specific. So in the last 3 months, with how many partners have you engaged in penile vaginal sex? And obviously we'd have to be specific based on our sample and who's actually going to be in there and if those questions would make sense to them. We also want to think about avoiding bias in our questions and questionnaires. So if we're gearing our questions only to certain gender experiences, making assumptions about sexual risk behaviors, etc., we want to try and be as inclusive as possible in the way that we ask questions and the questions that we actually ask. We want to avoid leading, emotional, and evocative questions. I recently designed and implemented, I think I've mentioned this before, a survey of people who go to sex parties. And so there are one of the things we wanted to know about is if people were pressured to engage in sexual activity or in play at play parties. And so a not so good question would be, do you think that women are often pressured to engage in sexual activity at play parties? So that would certainly be a leading question. And so what we ended up asking for that instead is, what percentage of people do you think pressured other people to engage in sex? What percentage of people at this party were pressured to engage in sex? And so we asked some follow-up questions about gender and sexual orientation within that. Avoiding double-barreled question, your book talks about this as well. Do you think that men and women should? Whatever. And so we, based on their answer to this question, we wouldn't know if they were referring to men or to women. Selectively utilize these negative questions and avoid double negatives. I have a particularly hard time understanding negative questions and double negative questions. So for example, people should not be required to reveal their latest STI testing results to new partners. So if I disagree with that, then I think people should be required, I think. Even as I say it now, I have a hard time to pull that together and try and understand what that means. So your book talks about reverse coded items as ways of breaking up a survey and checking for attention on the survey. So just think about if people are able to understand and answer those questions. I think those are really good things to do, to use those kinds of negative questions to break up a survey and to make sure people are paying attention and actually answering a survey in a thoughtful way and not just choosing for example, for every answer. But we have to think about making sure that people can understand those. And then we have to utilize and define appropriate terminology. So for example, we use the term fluid bonded in the survey that we worked on, but not everybody knows what fluid bonded means. So when we did ask a question about that, we actually defined fluid bonded and said some people use the term fluid bonded to refer to the following. Have you engaged in that? Or we said it much better than that, but that's the gist of it. And we also have to think about creating our response options. They should be clear, appropriately specific or general, non-overlapping, and applicable to the question itself. Your book talks about this really nicely. It's always good if we can anticipate all possible response options and provide an other option and give people some space to write in that other option. This is something that I'm working on right now with the sex party data. For all of the questions, when we gave people a range of options, we provided other and allowed them to write in. And that was really helpful to us. And wow, there was a lot of stuff we did not think of. And so now we're going back and trying to add in other categories and categorize people into those other categories based on what they said. And some of them were things that we just were surprised about and we didn't even think of. And some of them were things that I look back now and I could kick myself in the face for not thinking of. So providing that other option. And I think this is where multiple methods can come in really handy to be able to do some pilot testing or some qualitative interviews ahead of time to try and get a sense of those options and to try and be as exhaustive as possible in providing people with response options. Always specify timeframes and the response unit. So do you want people to respond, for example, your book gives the example of income. Instead of saying, how much money did you make? Do you mean last year, last month, in a week? So give some people your sense of time frame and what unit they should respond in. You always have to think about memory and self-report issues in here. So if you're asking people the number of partners in their lifetime or in the last 5 years, based on your sample, is that something people are going to be able to remember or to report in any meaningful way? And again, as I mentioned before, it's always good when we can help facilitate recall. So give people a date range. If you're asking in the last 3 months, give people the date of the beginning of that 3-month range. Utilize previous responses. So you said that you've had X number of partners in the last 3 months. Of those 49 partners, tell me how many of those were casual partners, how many of those were whatever, and then laying that out in a way that helps people remember what they said and break that down. So anything you can do to help people with this is really useful. And we always have to think about our response option variable types. And I've mentioned a little bit about variable types earlier on in the semester. So do we want to give people nominal responses? So choose a category for gender or for sexual identity, for example. Do we want to do ordinal responses? So for example, if we were interested in the number of partners in your lifetime, some people may be able to very easily say 3 or 7 or 29. But for other people, that may be more challenging. So we may be able to say, how many partners have you had in your lifetime? 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to whatever. Agree to disagree, Likert scales, are these ordinal responses? Or do we want people to count? So the number of partners, give me the exact number of partners you've had in your lifetime. And for some people, we have to realize that they're going to ballpark it. So they may say, I don't know, roughly 300. And so they're going to write 300. It may actually be 400. It may actually be 250. And so you want to try and get a sense of your sample in some ways and the number of partners that they may have had. When we went into the sex party research, we thought maybe this would be a sample that had a higher number of partners because they reported going to sex parties. That is an assumption, interestingly, that was not borne out as much as we thought it was going to be. So we gave people a range, which I still think was a good decision. There were certainly some people who said over 500, somewhere between 100 and 300. And so I think it would have been challenging for a lot of people to give an exact number or even a ballpark number. But think about how you want to use those data. What's the purpose of getting that answer? What's your research question, and how will people be able to answer that? And that should give you some information about how you should ask the question and what kind of response options you should give people. And so I'll say this one last thing to think about how to ask questions and how to lay them out. A lot of people identify this cognitive response process that people go through to answer questions. So responding to items or questions involves 4 sort of cognitive steps. The first is being able to understand or comprehend the question. The second is being able to retrieve that information, to scan the memory, to create some sort of a coherent response. The third is a judgment process, so being able to formulate that appropriate response. And then the final one is actually generating a response. So producing a response that's internally consistent with your belief system, that is hopefully as accurate as possible in terms of being able to retrieve that information and formulate that response, and that is consistent with the question itself. So there's a lot that goes into, once we've already decided the measures and we know that they're getting at the constructs that we're interested in, we have our sample, actually laying out the survey and deciding on the appropriate questions, putting those in an order that hopefully will get us valid data and will help the participant move through that survey. Is a lot more involved than I think a lot of people think that it is. They think, all right, I have all these scales, I'm going to throw them into a survey and I'm done. I think the process of developing and actually creating a survey or an interview is a really lengthy and involved process. And so again, one of the reasons I chose this book is that the book gives, I think, a lot of really nice checklists for thinking through. So at the end of chapter 11, for example, he gives the checklist of running through and making sure you don't have any double-barreled questions, double negatives, do your questions and your response choices match. And so I think there's really good concrete advice in this book that I think you can use as you move forward in your dissertation research and in your research career more broadly. So that's all I will say about that. We'll talk much more about a lot of these things as we actually do this process in the classroom and in the process of building our survey. So certainly if you have questions, post those under the general discussion forum, thoughts, post those, and I'll respond to those or we'll talk about these much more in our first weekend of class. All right, thanks guys.